talk on combined derivative, antiderivative, anti-aliasing. One word of warning beforehand. This is partially a negative result, so don't expect too much, but anyway. Before I dive into anti-aliasing, let me start with something very basic, signal sampling and reconstruction, something you all know. If we perfectly sample a signal and then reconstruct with the sync function, we get perfect reconstruction up to half the sampling rate. And then if the signal contains frequency components above half the sampling rate, we suffer from aliasing distortion. And yes, we will aim at reducing that. But before that, let's consider what can we exploit if we're also given samples of the signal's derivative. I skipped the motivation for now, why we should have samples of the signal derivative. Just assume we're given them. Surely that should be helpful in some way, and actually we have twice the number of samples, so maybe we should be able to achieve perfect reconstruction up to the sampling rate instead of half the sampling rate. And one approach to do that might possibly be, instead of just reconstructing with one function, the sync functions, use two different reconstruction kernels and just sum up the results. And it turns out, yes, this works with this particular choice. Look at the paper for proof that this actually does work. So we have the sync squared and this t times sync function basically as the two reconstruction kernels. And let's briefly look at them in the frequency domain. So sync squared is a triangle, and this other thing is basically a band-limited Hilbert transformer. And now we want to do anti-aliasing. That was the aim. So we just band-limited these functions with the effect that given an input signal up to half the sampling rate, we get perfect reconstruction. If we have a signal above half the sampling rate, that will be completely attenuated because we have perfectly band-limited these functions and will not produce any aliasing. And for even higher frequencies, bad things might happen. So that's the idea here. So we have these red functions, the band-limited case, and they can also be analytically be transformed back to time domain. And as they are band-limited by reconstruction, we can just safely sample them and then have some discrete time functions which we can plug in to get samples of a band-limited signal. So this is what the resulting system looks like. It looks similar to what I had before, except now I have on the output side still the discrete time signal, and H1, H2 are now discrete time filters. So if we feed a signal below half the sampling rate, we get that signal out again, perfect reconstruction, or rather samples of it. So the black dots on the right-hand plot are the samples, and the gray line is just reconstruction for visualization purposes, and yeah, perfect reconstruction. If I just keep on increasing the sampling rate above half the sampling rate, then H1 and H2 just work in a way that the signal canceled, and instead of suffering aliasing distortion, I completely cancel the signal. So I've perfectly suppressed the aliasing that would be there if I had just, nothing except for sampling. And if I go even higher with my frequency, above the sampling rate, well, aliasing starts. And as you note, the amplitude has increased. It's 2 now at the output, so it's even counterproductive. And if I just go on increasing the input frequency even further, the output will just increase in amplitude. So up to the sampling rate, if the signal is confined up to the sampling rate, everything is perfect. I have perfect suppression of the aliasing components. But if I have even higher components, things actually start to get worse. And then I have 180-degree phase changes, but that doesn't really matter. So we do have some form of anti-aliasing called derivative-based anti-aliasing here. It requires samples of the single derivative in addition to just samples of the signal. It allows limiting aliasing of single components up to the sampling rate, but for even higher frequency single components, it's actually counterproductive. Now to put this into some perspective, I'm interested in anti-aliasing for nonlinear systems. In the simplest case, it's just a nonlinear mapping function. So I assume an input signal u, which is band limited to half the sampling rate. So that's benign, but then I apply some nonlinear mapping, introduce harmonics, which might violate the band limitation, and I get aliasing distortion. Now, in this case, I can relatively easily obtain samples of the single derivative after applying f by the chain rule, and then I just need the derivative of my nonlinearity f, and samples of the input signal's derivative. But given that that is band limited by assumption, I might be able to estimate samples quite easily. But that still leaves the problem of this being actually counterproductive for higher order harmonics. So if I have a very benign f, which doesn't introduce any high order harmonics, that would be okay, but usually I won't. So the idea here was to combine this with an approach that kind of tames my function f to not introduce so many high frequency components. And basically, that's what the antiderivative aliasing does, which we've heard today a couple of times already. So antiderivative aliasing, just the basic idea. You take your input samples, you do a piecewise linear reconstruction to get a continuous signal, you apply the nonlinearity f, then you average over one sampling interval to have some low-pass filtering effect, and then you can sample that. And it's not perfect aliasing suppression, because this averaging over one sampling period is not a perfect low-pass, but it does quite substantial low-pass filtering, so it's helpful. And the reason why this is attractive is that you can compute that completely in discrete time. So it's equivalent to this equation where capital F is the antiderivative of the nonlinear function f. So it's equivalent to this time continuous system on top. Now, I want to replace my nonlinear function f with this construction, and then I also want to have samples of the derivative at the output. So I need samples of the x derivative in this case. So I just plug in derivative in this continuous time equivalent system and take a look at that a little closer. And turns out I have the this averaging filter, and taking the derivative, both are linear systems, I can just combine them. They're just two Dirac impulses apart by one sampling interval, so I can replace that with a sum of the signal in a delayed version, or a difference rather than. And once I've rewritten it this way, it becomes apparent that actually I only need samples at the sampling instance, right? I mean, up to this point here, looking from backwards, I just need the signal value at sampling instance, and the piecewise linear interpolation also gives me the input if I just evaluate it at the sampling instance. So this is just this relatively simple discrete time system. So it's actually just the first order difference approximation to taking the derivative. But note, this is not in any way an approximation I've done in this step. The result is the approximation of the taking the derivative, but it's actually the correct derivative applied to the antiderivative, anti-aliased system. And I mean, it becomes quite simple, but then again, applying a derivative to something with antiderivative in the name sounds like a lot of things might cancel out and you end up with something simple. And indeed, that is the case. So if this is the baseline system with antiderivative anti-aliasing applied, I can now combine with the derivative-based anti-aliasing just by using this derivative calculation path and applying the filters H1 and H2. So in the upper path, I have samples of the signal after applying the nonlinear function, and in the lower path, samples of the derivative, both obtained after applying antiderivative aliasing. And then I just do the approach with the two filters to reconstruct. One thing I want to point out here is that if we consider the computation complexity, it's comparable to 2 times oversampling, right? I mean, we obviously double the number of nonlinear function evaluations we have to do. These are now 2 different functions, and when oversampling, we would evaluate the antiderivative 2 times as often. One might be a little more efficient than the other, but roughly comparable. And we also introduced 2 linear filters here. if we upsample and downsample, we also need linear filtering, and as it's argued in the paper, the required filters orders are roughly comparable. So there's a lot of, it depends in there, but roughly it's comparable in computation complexity to 2 times oversampling. Now let's look at the result we obtained. So I feed in a sinusoid and apply this arcus-tangent function. On the left, if we don't do any anti-aliasing, the red crosses mark the desired harmonics, and everything else is aliasing distortion, and it looks pretty bad, as expected. If I just apply derivative anti-aliasing, so in this case, I can take the derivative of f analytically and also the excitation signal as the sinusoid. I can also obtain the derivative analytically, apply just the derivative-based anti-aliasing. And as you see, the strongest aliasing components are completely removed, which is good. Those were coming from the part between half the sampling rate and the sampling rate. The rest remains and is even amplified a bit, as was to be expected. So overall, this is still not satisfactory. Compare to just the antiderivative anti-aliasing, we get an additional roll-off of the high-frequency harmonics, so it doesn't help too much for the strongest aliasing components, which are just above half the sampling rates. But then the higher we go with the harmonics, the more reduction we get. So overall, we get a nice reduction, but just not for the strongest components. And that suggests that combining these two should be effective, and indeed it is. So one can argue whether this is not good enough or not, but it's definitely better than any of the other approaches alone. So this is the success part. And now comes why this is in part a negative result, is that if we compare to just doing 2 times oversampling combined with antiderivative anti-aliasing, which is comparable in computational complexity, that just works even better. So to give a very brief conclusion, that would be, okay, this works, and I think it's quite elegant theoretically. It's just not beneficial from a practical point of view. To expand a little bit, so we've seen that from single and its derivative, we can reconstruct perfectly up to the sampling rate instead of half the sampling rate, and putting that into perspective from the anti-aliasing point of view, that allows us to suppress any components stemming from the signal between half the sampling rate and the sampling rate, at the cost of amplifying components from even above the sampling rate. And if we combine that with antiderivative anti-aliasing, we get an effective anti-aliasing scheme, which is good, but yeah, well, antiderivative aliasing with 2 times oversampling is more effective still at the same cost. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. The question there.
So so the question is, so you use the arctan function, which is of course very easy to improve using oversampling. So you gave yourself the hardest possible test. What if you gave yourself an easy test, like a step function, for which upsampling doesn't work terribly well, and your method actually might not suffer as much as upsampling? Yeah,
but I'm not comparing to just oversampling. I'm comparing to antiderivative anti-aliasing combined with oversampling, and the antiderivative anti-aliasing already does a good deal to the step function. So it basically turns the step function into a ramp function, which is a lot easier than to deal with.
Right. So I'm just
I mean, yes, I've only shown one example here, but it's quite representative. I mean, you can construct examples where the derivative-based thing really shines if the function itself rolls off quickly enough that there are not too many components above half the sampling rates. But just your garden variety nonlinearity will usually looks somewhat like the example I've shown here.
Okay. Thank you.
These two methods are comparable in complexity.
Some people complain that linear phase filter for oversampling have pre-echoes. So maybe your method have no pre-echoes. So probably not.
I don't know. I don't perceive any pre-echoes with oversampling approaches, so I cannot really comment on that, because for me that's actually a non-issue, so I don't know.
Further questions? Okay, then thank you very much, Martin.